Hello, ladies and gentlemen. On the module A225, Ambition and Anxiety, 1789 to 1840, edited by Paul Lawrence. On influence, youth today, young teenagers, young adults, mature adults, OAPs. We're looking for where's their life going to end? Where's their life going? What's next? Change the direction you're heading, change vision, broaden your horizon. We're on our academic integrity of arts and humanities. We're going to reference our reading. 1 Unit 4, page 162. We've got a pen to outline our works, outline words that we could find the meaning of and understanding. Some of the same attributes can be seen in the evangelical moments which developed within the Church of England over the same period. Doctrinally, the characteristics of evangelism as a movement include a search for guidance, both temporal and spiritual. Within the Bible, a focus on the sacrifice of Christ and the redemptive quality for a fallen humanity, and the necessity of conversion to Christianity as an adult, rather than baptism as an infant. This latter tenet led evangelical adherence towards social action, as David Ferguson notes. The activism that was a hallmark of evangelicalism was the logical outcome of the experience of conversion 2010. One of the most influential evangelical groups in the Church of England was the so-called Clapham sect, which gathered around William Wilberforce. Wilberforce, whom you have encountered briefly in Unit 1, was a young MP and a close friend of Pitt the Younger. The Clapham sect included professional and businessmen, all of whom were determined to translate evangelical Christians' values into social action. They were adept at both raising funds and organising pressure groups in the unit of the British Isle and Atlantic world of Unit 7. You'll find out more about Wilberforce's involvement in the campaign to abolish slavery. But here we should note that evangelicalism was also the seabed for campaigns against drunkenness, generating the enormously influential temperance movement. Wilberforce founded the Society for the Suppression of Vice in 1802 and for lobbying against inhumane conditions in the cities and factories. Similarly, care for the needy was an expression of the evangelical desire to obey the commands found in the Bible. Lord Anthony Ashley, Earl of Shaftesbury, 1801 to 1885, for example, was motivated by his religious beliefs to work towards the Factory Act of 1833, which made it illegal to employ children under the age of 9 in textile factories and limited working hours for older children. As John Wolfe has noted, a deepening of Ashley's religious commitment in the 1830s and his conviction of the imminence of the second advent of Christ inspired him in a sense of the urgency of saving souls and of reforming national life, so as to mitigate the impact of the coming divine judgment, 1995. When we call to mind Victorian morality and moral crusades, we're in large part considering reform groups and movements either led by inspired by evangelicals from the Clapham sect. As Stephen Tompkin notes, the ethos of Clapham become the spirit of age. 2010. New Knowledge and the Factory Acts. The Factory Acts were a series of laws passed in the first half of the 19th century that gradually introduced a measure of regulation and state oversight of industrial working conditions. Many applied particularly to child workers. Early acts, such as the Health and Morals of Apprentices Act of 1802, sought both to improve the safety of workshops and to suggest limits to the working day. 12 hours initially, excluding breaks. The early acts were only partially and sporadically enforced until the Factory Act of 1833 set up a professional factory in Spectorate. Previously, the role of enforcement had fallen to local magistrates, officials whose duties you encounter in more detail in Unit, the birth of the modern state, Unit 5. Later acts introduced further safeguards for industrial labourers. The Factories Act of 1847, for example, effectively limited the working day in textile mills in 10 hours. While in many ways these acts can be seen as pragmatic responses to some of the more dangerous ramifications of rapid industrial development, the fierce debates that they prompted also show clearly the interplay between the practical and spiritual knowledge discussed in this unit. Some political economists believed that less regulation would lead to a more efficient economy, but others argued that the effective framework of law was important in order to ensure profitable competition. Still others believed that, because the women and children to whom the acts were directed were not free agents, the state should intervene. Many utilitarians were a view of free market forces were likely to lead to the greatest happiness for the greatest number. But some felt strongly that a rational, efficient, and humane government administration was the best guarantor of happiness. Many reformers were inspired by the religious beliefs to support the Factory Acts, which they believed would improve the conditions of the working class. Reform campaigns also drew often on romantic imagery. The poet William Wordsworth depiction of childhood innocence and maternal instinct corrupted by factories and nature crushed by machines were powerful campaign tools. Overall, it is impossible Overall, it is impossible to say precisely why the Factory Acts were passed, but this is set legislation undoubtedly provides a useful window into the development and practical influence of new ways of seeing the world in the early 19th century. On page 164 of Unit 4, Managing Uncertainty, New Forms of Knowledge. While key individuals were without a doubt enormously influential both politically and socially at this time, it is important also to consider the place of religion in daily life and the role played by spiritual knowledge in the lives of those lower down the social order. It has been estimated that in 1800, around 90% of the population professed a religious affiliation. Although Methodism was by this point the largest non-conformist denomination, with 265,000 members, the vast majority of the entire population of England and Wales still saw themselves as members of the established Anglican Church. Field 2007, this does not necessarily mean they regularly attended worship. By the 1830s to 40s, for example, it was common for the average Church of England congregation to represent only about 20% of the population in towns. That said, however, there is no mistaking the extent to which the sheer material presence of Christianity pervaded every dimension of 19th century culture. Brown 2001. Of particular note, perhaps, is the way in which involvement in religiously inspired social reform movements, such as the anti-slavery movement that you encounter in Unit 7, and the associational life of the church was important for women in an era when full participation in business and public life was much less common than it is in UK today. Overall, then, religious belief mattered throughout the period 1789 to 1840 and was an important component of the way ordinary people understood the social world and their place within it. While not necessarily in position to a more rational forms of knowledge discussed in section 4.1 above, and while religious belief often resulted in a strong drive, a duty and practical impact, religion also cultivated a sense of awe, mystery, and the dramatic. In this, it shared many similarities with Roman movement. Romanticism was an artistic and literary movement that reached its peak across Europe in the early 19th century, focused on activities and artistic outputs of elite individuals. Creativity and originality were prized above all the characteristics. Romanticism celebrated emotion, individualism, and the splendour of the natural world, placing great emphasis on engagement with nature, which was sent to both inspirational to artists and writers, and more nourishing to the human spirit than the artificial surroundings of the towns and cities. The contrasting world of polite society, Romanticism as a way of understanding the world also often celebrated the folk traditions of the past and the will of the people. Although there was little sense that Romanticism or individual romantics aimed at particular practical goals, the movement as a whole provided an influential counterweight to practical forms of knowledge outlined in section 4.1 and bolstered support for certain nationalist movements in the period, as evidence, for example, by the involvement of the poet Lord Byron, 1788-1824, the Greek War of Independence. While Romanticism was an international movement, Britain was in many ways at the forefront. The publication of lyrical ballads, 1798, by the poets Wordsworth and Samuel Coleridge, for example, has often been seen as a seminal moment in the founding of the movement. The two poets whom you met briefly in Unit 1 aimed to move beyond the dry, overly inflectional poetry of the Enlightenment as they saw it, by writing poems that captured the essential passions of the heart, as Wordsworth wrote in the preface to their second volume of ballads that aim to choose instances and situations from common life and to relate them in a selection of language really used by men, and to make these instances and situations interesting by tracing in them the primary laws of our nature. Low and rustic life was generally chosen because, in that condition, the essential passions of the heart speak a plainer and more empathetic language. In the somewhat lengthily titled Lines Written at a Small Distance from Our House and Sent by My Little Boy to the person to whom they are addressed, for example, Wordsworth exhorted his sister to come to the woods on the first mild day of March. Turning to 4.2, William Wordsworth, Lines Written 1798, located at the end of the unit. After you'd read this, answer the following question. Which lines or elements of the poem indicated the Roman focus on emotion and rejection of conventional social norms? I hope you are able to identify certain makers of Romanticism. For example, the exhaustions to leave the morning task undone and to leave all books behind can be taken as a turning away from the conventions of polite society. The poem might also be taken as a rejection of industrial work ethics and of altruism. The reference to come forth and feel the sun and to experience nature's living calendar are clear allusions to the emotional joys of the natural world as opposed to the joyless constraints of society. Throughout, the poem illustrates the romantic yearning towards freedom, authentic emotional experience, and the natural world. In addition to the poets mentioned above, the Romantic movement also inspired many British painters. John Constable, for example, wrote to a friend that painting is but another word of feeling, quoted in Jacobus 2012. And some of his best known works, such as that depicted in Figure 4.6, demonstrated the romantic focus on the natural world and the offensive of humble working class pursuits. While had characterized Romanticism thus far as an artistic, spiritual, emotional way of understanding the world rather than an intellectual one, this does not necessarily mean that it remained somehow abstract or without real world influence. The art, poetry, and literature produced during this period were highly significant in the later development of the cultural life in Britain and Ireland. In addition, however, Romanticism and romantic works of art and literature were important to the growth of consolidation of the national identity during the period. Although, although English national identity is often seen as having developed over a period of centuries, there are debates among historians as to whether the national sentiment that become more evident in Scotland, Wales, and Ireland during the 19th century was real. That is a long standing and natural sense of cultural belonging inspired by shared culture or invented. That is actually a relatively new phenomenon inspired perhaps deliberately by elites looking to build new forms of cultural allegiance. Regardless, the Romantic movement certainly produced new cultural artifacts, paintings, works of literature, music that sought to encapsulate national identity and to bolster national pride. Whether or not it existed beforehand, although Scotland had been united with England since 1707, here Romanticism was strongly associated with the development of a distinctly Scottish literature and drama. The poet Robert Burns, for example, to whom you are briefly introduced in Unit 1, was and is widely regarded as the first national poet of Scotland, and he wrote in both Scottish dialect and English. Burns collected folk songs from across Scotland, often revising or adapting them. His song, Scot Whahi, written in 1793, takes the form of speech given prior to the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, when Scotland retained its sovereignty from England and quickly come to serve as an unofficial national anthem of the country. The writer Walter Scott, whom you may recall from Unit 1, also began as a poet, often collecting and published Scottish ballads. He was also, however, a pioneer of the genre of the historical novel. In works such as Rob Roy, 1817, and Heart of Midlothian, 1818, Scott helped to define Scottish culture identity. Thus, while primarily a cultural movement, Romanticism in Scotland was closely linked to the rise of Scottish national identity and also influenced Romanticism across Europe. In both Wales and Ireland, Romanticism was associated with revival of traditional poetry in the Welsh and Irish languages. In Wales, for example, Edward Williams, 1746 to 1826, was more usually known by his poetic pseudonym Ilo Morganwg, sought to preserve the literary and cultural traditions of Wales by building a collection of ancient manuscripts. It later transpired that he had forged many of these, but he also influential in reviving the traditional Eisteddfodder Welsh festivals of literature, music and performance, which contributed significantly to the preservation of the English Welsh language and culture during the 19th century. Ireland was still reeling from the failure of the Irish Rebellion of 1798, an uprising against British rule led primarily by United Irishmen, influenced by the ideas of the French and American revelations. Here too, however, Romantic authors sought both to capture the revived, falling oral traditions, but also to express cultural unity and at times political discontent. As Claire Connolly notes, an important effect of Romanticism in Ireland was the development of Romantic nationalism. Ireland emerged from this period with a renovated reputation as a natural distinct national culture. This in turn fostered and supported new theories of nationality and nourished the cultural nationalism of the 1830s and 1840s. Connolly, 2006. You'll learn more about the spread of nationalism in Ireland in the unit Imagine Nations Made Real. The Romantic movement also contributed to launch and progress of national movements across Europe that led eventually to the foundation of Greece, 1832, and Belgium, 1831, and to uprisings against Russia in Poland, 1830 and 1846. Later in the century, Romantic art and literature that sought to trace a presumed national heritage also contributed to the unification of Italy, 1859 to 61, and Germany, 1866 to 71. To conclude this section, what I hope you have garnered is an understanding that there were many different currents of thought and types of knowledge circulating and developing in the period of 1789 to 1840, in contrast to the practical knowledge of section 4.1. It is possible also to trace the development of ways looking at the world that were more focused on emotion than utility, more concerned with personal experience and the inner spiritual life with the expansion of government and the improvement of the economy. Religion and Romanticism were in some ways intertwined in its focus of free will and emotion. Methodism, as it developed, incorporated romantic influences. A sense of awe, mystery, and the dramatic were often features of Methodist religious practice. But this was combined with a strong drive towards doing one's duty and making a practical impact. You learn more about 19th century religion in the unit of Ireland and the famine. Page 170, Sites of Knowledge Power. In this unit, so far we have at some point considered knowledge on its own terms. As an abstract discourse or debate, we might call this approach of intellectual history, tracing the genesis and onward transmission of particular ideas. But we have also sought to analyse how new ideas and ways looking at the world could have impact on the development of government policy and the lived experience of daily life. This section will consider this interplay between ideas, knowledge, and the material world a little further. It is possible to discern the embodiment of new ways of looking at the world in the construction of institutions, state and private, in the period of 1789 to 1840. What do I mean by this? Well, as new ideas arose, they did not remain abstract. By raising debate and by interacting with other social trends, they could find expression in new laws or new forms of association, such as learn or statistical societies, for instance. They could also lead to the building of new types of institutions. The period of 1789 to 1840 witnessed, for example, the construction of many institutions of criminal justice, such as police stations, houses, and prisons, as well as other institutions such as workhouses, mental hospitals, and later schools. They might also be deemed institutions of control. Equally, however, other new buildings might be described as cultural rather than official. Significant new cultural institutions constructed during this period, such as the British Museum 1823 and the National Gallery 1831, can also be seen to embody particular new ways of looking at the world, and both official and cultural institutions can be read as evidence of a desire to map, control, and represent the world. The remainder The remainder of this unit will consider some of the new institutions and access how their construction related to new types of knowledge, new official institutions. Without question, the later 18th century and 1840, witnessed the emergence of new institutions of control. What do I mean by this term? I mean state-sponsored or government-run institutions of various types that sought to inculcate particular forms of behaviour amongst subsets of the population. To take one obvious example, this period witnessed a wholesale revision of the mechanisms of criminal justice. Legal codes were revised, recognisably modern police force was set up. Starting with the Metropolitan Police in 1829, the court system was overhauled and new forms in punishment were devised. All these developments were prompted by change, social, industrial, and economic, and resulted in obvious differences in the built environment. New police stations and courthouses were constructed, and, perhaps most dramatically, the period arguably witnessed in the birth of the modern prison. And you'll also explore in more detail below. All these new institutions of criminal justice were underpinned by new forms of knowledge and new ways of understanding the individual and his or her actions. However, it is not just within these very obvious sites of criminal justices that new knowledge led to new institutions of control. Workhouses, for example, which come under greater central scrutiny following the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, can certainly be seen as institutions of control. Here, certain classes of the poor received welfare, but also had their movements restricted and their diets controlled, and were compelled to complete particular forms of monotonous labour was punishment administered for non-conformity, while the mental asylum constructed in the period from 1790 onwards tended to shun the secrecy and harsh physical restraints of former madhouses. They too were still closed and regulated environments based around the authority of the asylum physician. Thinking more broadly still, since the early 19th century there had been increasing efforts on the part of charities and voluntary associations to set up schools for the poor, both in the 1808 Society for Promoting the Lancasterian System of Education of the Poor and the 1811 National Society for Promoting the Education of the Poor in the principles of established church in England and Wales clearly aimed to inculcate certain behavioural norms in the children of the poor. From the 1830s onwards, the state also came to be involved in education more directly. What links all these types of official institutions, prisons, police stations, courts, workhouses, mental hospitals and schools, and why do I feel justified in talking about them en bloc? I would argue they share two key characteristics. They were all, to a greater or lesser degree, closed and or regulated social environments seeking to change behaviours or norms. And in all cases, the behavioural changes being aimed at and the methods used to achieve them were derived from new ideas and forms of knowledge. Power within these institutions was a function of new knowledge. The notion that knowledge is intrinsically bound up by the power in its exercise owes much to work of the 20th century French philosopher Michael Foucault, whose ideas were highly influential during the 1970s and 1980s. Knowledge for Foucault was synonymous with, or at least a prerequisite for, power. His written work is complex, some might say willfully so, but as he explained it, he believed that in any society there are manifold relations of power which primate, characterize, and constitute the social body, and these regulations of power cannot themselves be established, consolidated, nor implemented without the production, accumulation, circulation, and function of a discourse. Thus, power is contained within and operates through discourse, which for Foucault meant both knowledge and the social structures and mechanisms that reflect it. In other words, if particular ways of understanding the world garner sufficient currency, then they start to structure the world by setting the terms of what can or cannot be known and discussed. Foucault say power as so enmeshed with knowledge that is used. The combined term power and knowledge to signify the power is solely constituted through the accepted forms of knowledge, scientifically understanding and truth. In order to help you understand this idea of knowledge power a little more, I'll focus now on the birth of the prison. The period 1789 to 1840 witnessed huge changes in the way criminal justice system punished offenders. At the start of the period, execution of transportation, primarily to Australia, following Britain's loss of its American colonies, were the norm for all serious offences, and many more minor ones. Executions were public and would remain until 1868 and regularly drew crowds, numbering in their thousands. Such prisons as did exist were primarily used to detain offenders before trial and to imprison debtors who could not pay their fines. The King's Bench prison, depicted in figure 4.7, is one such debtors' prison. Prisons in the latter part of the 18th century were thus nothing like their modern counterparts. Prisoners had to make their own arrangements for food, and superior accommodation could be obtained by paying their jailer. Alcohol, sex, and gambling were prevalent, and prisoners of all ages and categories were mixed together, leading to rowdy and riotous behaviour on occasions. By the 1840s, there had been a profound shift in the forms of punishment commonly dispensed by the courts, away from punishments of the body, such as hanging and corporal punishment, towards incarnation. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, for example, around 90% of those condemned to death were receiving pardons or having their punishment commuted to transportation. Godfrey and Lawrence, 2015. All those executions that did take place continued to draw large crowds. The use of so-called bloody code gradually declined. In its place, the 19th century witnessed the rise of the prison as a form of punishment in its own right. The rise of prison can be seen as representative of a shift in the aims of punishment. While the death penalty was primarily a retributive punishment, prison sentence can be seen as reformative. New schemes for reforming offenders, coupled with anxiety over the inefficiency of the death penalty as a deterrent and concerns over conditions in local prisons, first raised by philanthropist and prison reformer John Howard, 1726-1790, in the state of the prison in England and Wales, 1777.